My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 62 years old, and at my own daughter's wedding, a wedding for which I paid $65,000 from my life savings, her new husband informed me my seat was on a folding chair in the kitchen. By the end of the night, their picture-perfect life, built on my sacrifice, would be in ruins, and they would have no one to blame but themselves. It's a long story, but I have a feeling some of you might understand. I'm telling it from my little home here in Ohio. It's just past 8 p.m., and the fireflies are starting to come out, winking in the twilight. It's peaceful now, a peace I fought hard for. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Let me know in the comments. It makes the world feel a little smaller, a little friendlier as I share this piece of my life with you. The drive to the wedding venue was filled with a quiet, shimmering anticipation that felt almost sacred. It was a perfect day in early June, the kind of day painters try to capture on canvas but never quite get the light right. The sky was a soft, impossibly gentle blue, and the Ohio countryside rolled by my car window in vibrant, living shades of green. I had the windows of my trusty 10-year-old Buick down, letting the warm, honeysuckle-scented air play with the professionally styled curls of my hair. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt genuinely, uncomplicatedly beautiful. At 62, a retired nurse who had spent more than 30 years of her life in sensible shoes and shapeless scrubs, feeling beautiful was a rare and precious commodity. But today was not about me. Today was Victoria's Day, my daughter, my entire world. And for her, I had spared no expense. The dress I was wearing was a deep, elegant mauve, made of a soft, flowing fabric that shimmered when it caught the light. It had cost more than my first car, a staggering $800. I'd physically winced when the cashier rang it up, the practical side of me screaming in protest. But then I remembered the look on Victoria's face when she saw me try it on in the boutique, a rare, genuine flash of admiration that momentarily erased years of teenage sullenness. That look had made it worth every single penny. The venue, this sprawling, opulent estate called The Willows, came into view looking even more magical than its brochure. A grand, white-pillared mansion, straight out of a movie, sat overlooking a glassy lake. Around it, ancient weeping willow trees dipped their leafy branches into the water as if bowing in reverence. It was a fairy tale, a $65,000 fairy tale to be precise. My fairy tale, a gift from my heart to hers. Every last cent had come from my retirement savings, the nest egg I had painstakingly built over decades of double shifts, missed holidays, and a quiet, solitary life after her father, Michael, decided our family was a burden he no longer wished to carry. This day, this perfect, beautiful day, was meant to be the culmination of all that sacrifice. To see my daughter, my Victoria, marry the man of her dreams in a place like this, it was supposed to be everything. I pulled into the designated parking area, the crunch of gravel under my tires the only sound. I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing down the front of my dress one last time. I felt a flutter of nerves, the happy kind, the kind of mother is supposed to feel. As I walked toward the grand entrance, I could hear the sophisticated notes of a string quartet and see the other guests milling about on the stone patio, sipping champagne from tall, elegant flutes. I saw a few of Victoria's friends, young women I'd watched grow up, who had eaten countless grilled cheese sandwiches at my kitchen table. They smiled and waved, their faces bright with excitement. Then I saw him, Richard, my new son-in-law, looking impossibly handsome and confident in his tailored black tuxedo. He stood near the entrance like a king surveying his court, a practiced, charming smile fixed on his face as he greeted guests. When his eyes landed on me, that smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. He excused himself from a conversation and strode over to me, his gait proprietary and purposeful. He said, "Eleanor, you look lovely." "Thank you, Richard. The place is breathtaking. Truly, you and Victoria have done an amazing job." He replied, "We have a certain standard." He placed a hand on my elbow. It was not a gesture of welcome or affection, but of guidance, of control. He began leading me away from the main flow of guests, away from the music and the laughter, to a quiet, carpeted corridor off the main hall. He said, "I need to show you to your seat before the ceremony begins." A small frown touched my lips. "Oh, I thought I was sitting with Sarah. She texted me this morning and said our table was number 3, right near the front." Sarah was my best friend of 30 years, my rock through the messy divorce and all the lonely struggles that followed. The idea of not sitting with her was unthinkable. Richard chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that grated on my nerves. He said smoothly, "There's been a slight change in the seating plan. For aesthetic reasons, you understand." He stopped in front of a pair of imposing, swinging metal doors, the kind you see leading into a restaurant kitchen. I could hear the faint, frantic clatter of dishes and the low, industrial hum of refrigerators behind them. A cold, sick feeling began to pool in the pit of my stomach. I asked him, "Richard, what is this?" My voice barely a whisper, already dreading the answer. He gestured to the doors with a flick of his wrist, as if presenting a grand prize. "Your place is in here." I stared at him, my mind refusing to process the words. It had to be a joke, a cruel, tasteless joke. I asked again, "In the kitchen?" He corrected as if the terminology made any difference. "It's more of a staging area. Look, Eleanor," he said, his voice taking on a tone of patronizing patience. "Victoria and I have a very specific visual theme for this wedding. The photos, the video, everything needs to be perfect. Aesthetic consistency is key to achieving the look we want." His words hung in the air, cold and sharp as shards of glass. Aesthetic consistency. He was saying, in the most brutally polite way imaginable, that I didn't fit, that my 62-year-old face, my carefully chosen mauve dress, my very presence would somehow mar the perfection of their photographs. My pride, the quiet, resilient dignity I had carried through every hardship in my life, rose up to meet his arrogance. I said, "Richard, there must be a mistake. I am the mother of the bride. I paid for this entire event. I will not be seated in a kitchen." His smile vanished completely, replaced by a mask of cold, hard impatience. "It wasn't a request, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, making it all the more menacing. "Victoria and I have already discussed it and made the decision. This is where you'll be. It's for the best." He pushed one of the heavy, swinging metal doors open, revealing the stark, fluorescently lit chaos behind. Stainless steel counters gleamed harshly, stacks of dirty trays waited to be washed, and in a small, cleared-out corner stood a single, solitary, metal folding chair. It was positioned next to a broken catering cart with a wobbly wheel and a stack of stained linen napkins. He didn't escort me to the chair. He simply held the door open and looked at me, his expression making it clear that the conversation was over. A wave of pure, hot humiliation washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. I felt the eyes of a passing waiter on me, his young face a canvas of pity and disbelief. My beautiful dress suddenly felt like a costume for a fool. My professionally styled hair felt like a cruel mockery. Numbly, without another word, I walked past him through those swinging doors and into the clatter and chaos of the kitchen. The doors swung shut behind me, the sound a heavy, final thud. The joyful music from the grand hall was instantly muffled, replaced by the clang of pots and the hiss of a dishwasher.
I was sealed in my designated place. I stood there for a long, silent moment, the acrid smell of grease and bleach filling my lungs, my $800 dress feeling utterly, painfully absurd, next to a large gray bin filled with discarded dinner rolls. The fairy tale was over before it had even begun. The world of the wedding, my daughter's wedding, came to me in frustrating, muffled bursts. The joyful swell of the string quartet playing Canon in D, the collective murmur of guests finding their seats, the eventual eruption of applause. It all sounded distant and distorted, filtered through the thick metal of the kitchen doors. Every time a waiter bustled in or out, a whirlwind of white linen and clattering plates, the doors would swing open for a brief, tantalizing moment. In those flashes, I caught glimpses of the life I was supposed to be a part of. I saw snippets of the towering floral arrangements I had spent hours selecting, of guests in beautiful attire I had effectively funded, of a grand celebration I had orchestrated from the shadows, only to be banished from the stage. I finally sank onto the cold, unyielding metal of the folding chair, my posture unnaturally straight. I refused to slouch. I refused to cry. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I focused my gaze on a long, jagged crack in the linoleum floor, tracing its path with my eyes as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world, trying to detach my mind from the searing, physical pain in my chest. A young kitchen worker, a girl named Maria, according to her name tag, who couldn't have been older than Victoria when she'd graduated high school, approached me hesitantly. She looked at me with wide, dark, sympathetic eyes. "Ma'am, can I get you some water? Or maybe a soda?" she asked softly, her voice thick with a Spanish accent. "Thank you, dear. Water would be lovely. That's very kind of you," I managed to say, my voice tight and strained. Her simple, unprompted act of human kindness was a stark contrast to the calculated cruelty of my own family, and it almost broke my resolve. The hot sting of tears pricked at the back of my eyes, but I blinked them away fiercely. Then, a moment of expectant stillness fell over the venue. The music softened to a hush. The ceremony was starting. The doors swung open as a server rushed through with a tray of champagne glasses, and in that brief 5-second window I saw her, my Victoria. She was at the end of the long aisle, a vision in white lace, holding the arm of her father Michael, the man who had walked out on us when she was 8 years old with nothing more than a note on the kitchen table. The man who hadn't contributed a single dollar to her college fund, who had missed every birthday and graduation, was now beaming with paternal pride, as if he'd been Father of the Year. It was a bitter, predictable pill to swallow, and I had braced myself for that particular hypocrisy. What I wasn't braced for was what happened next. As Victoria stood there, waiting for her moment to walk down the aisle, her eyes swept the room, taking in the adoring faces of her guests. For a fraction of a second, her gaze locked onto the swinging doors, and she saw me peeking through the gap. I know she did. I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, a momentary tightening of her jaw. There was no shock, there was no horror, there was no, "Oh my God, what is my mother in the kitchen?" Instead, a small, almost imperceptible, knowing smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a confident, serene smile, the kind of smile you give when you know everything is going exactly according to your intricate plan. Then she turned her attention back to the front, her face once again a mask of radiant, bridal innocence. That smile did more damage than all of Richard's cruel words combined. Richard was an arrogant stranger I barely knew. But Victoria was my daughter, my flesh and blood, or so I believed. I held her when she was sick, championed her every dream, and financed her entire life. That smile was a confession, written in a language only a mother could understand. It told me this wasn't just Richard's doing. This was her decision, too. They had discussed it, they had planned it, and they were pleased with the outcome. A profound coldness spread through me, a chill that had nothing to do with the kitchen's industrial air conditioning. The memories I had been clinging to for comfort, of her as a little girl with scraped knees, of our quiet life together, suddenly felt tainted, like old photographs that had been bleeded of their color. I remembered with painful clarity one year she was 15 years old, and she had her heart set on a school-sponsored trip to France. The cost was astronomical, nearly $3,000. My nurse's salary was already stretched thin as it was, supporting the two of us. But I couldn't bear to see the disappointment on her face. So I took on extra night shifts at the hospital for 6 solid months. I would come home as the sun was rising, my body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones, just to see the joy on her face when I finally handed her the check. I remember her hugging me so tight she nearly squeezed the air out of my lungs, her voice muffled in my shoulder as she said, "You're the best mom in the world." Where was that girl now? Had she ever really existed? Or had I just been a means to an end all along, a convenient tool to be used and then discarded? The ceremony unfolded. I heard the muffled vows, the distant I do's, the final triumphant swell of music through the metal doors. Then came the reception, the toasts. The doors swung open more frequently now as the staff began serving dinner, and the sounds were clearer. I heard Michael, my ex-husband, give a lambling, self-congratulatory speech about what a privilege it had been to raise such a wonderful and accomplished daughter, conveniently omitting the 30 years of actual sacrifice I put in. There was polite, scattered applause. Then Richard stood up. He thanked his parents effusively. He thanked Michael for raising an incredible woman and welcoming him into the family. He thanked the guests for coming to share in their perfect day. He never mentioned my name. Not once. It was as if I didn't exist. I was the ghost in the machine, the invisible engine that made the whole party run, but unworthy of even a passing acknowledgement. I wasn't just hidden. I was being systematically erased from my own daughter's story. I watched as the main courses were served, the beautiful plates of pan-seared salmon and filet mignon that I had agonized over during the tasting menu appointments. I saw my friend Sarah at her table, repeatedly looking towards the kitchen doors, her brow furrowed with a mixture of righteous anger and deep concern. She knew. She was the only one in that entire room who truly knew what this was costing me, in every sense of the word. Then I saw Victoria dancing with Richard, laughing, throwing her head back in carefree, unadulterated joy. She was living her perfect day, a day built on a foundation of my love and money, and she had successfully hidden the inconvenient, aging cornerstone of that foundation behind a kitchen door. The coldness in my chest began to solidify, turning from a dull, throbbing ache into something hard, sharp, and strangely powerful. The hurt was still there, a vast ocean of it, but something else was beginning to grow alongside it, a quiet, chilling, and absolute resolve. They thought I was a weak, sentimental old woman they could discard after use. They were about to find out just how wrong they were.
The final, public humiliation was the cake. It was a magnificent 5-tiered creation, a confection of white buttercream and delicate sugar flowers that I had personally designed with the baker over 3 separate consultations. As the servers wheeled it out to the center of the dance floor, the kitchen doors were propped open for a few minutes, granting me a clear, unobstructed view of the spectacle. Victoria and Richard stood beside it, holding a single ornate silver knife together, their smiles blindingly bright for the flashing cameras of the photographer. They fed each other a small, delicate piece, a perfect, romantic moment for their perfect, curated life. And in that moment, as I watched the daughter I had raised laugh without a single care in the world, the dam of my polite, stoic endurance finally, irrevocably broke. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. That would have been their victory, casting me as the hysterical, disruptive mother.
Instead, I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my expensive dress, and walked calmly to the small, single-stall employee restroom at the back of the kitchen. I needed a moment of sterile silence, a moment under harsh fluorescent lights, away from the sympathetic, pitying glances of the kitchen staff. I looked at my reflection in the cheap, streaked mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller, diminished, her eyes shadowed with a pain so deep it felt ancient. The expensive hairdo and the mauve dress seemed like a cruel, elaborate joke. I pulled out my phone from my small clutch purse, my fingers moving automatically, needing a distraction, something to focus on other than the crushing weight in my chest. A notification banner was illuminated at the top of the screen. An alert from my credit card company. Unusual activity detected. Please review your recent transactions. My heart, which I thought couldn't possibly sink any lower, found a new, terrifying depth. With a trembling finger, I tapped the notification. My banking app opened, slow to load on the weak kitchen Wi-Fi. The charge was from 2 days ago, a high-end spa called Serenity Now. The line item read, "The Serenity Bridal Package for 5." The total was a staggering $2,147.58. I had never been to this spa in my life. My hands started to shake uncontrollably as I scrolled down the list of recent transactions. There were other charges I didn't recognize. A high-end boutique called Glimmer and Gown. A fancy brunch spot downtown called the Mimosa House. All places I'd never been, all charged within the last week. Panic gave way to a cold, methodical anger. My mind, the nurse's mind, the one trained to assess a situation and find the source of the problem, took over. I closed the banking app and opened my email, my fingers flying across the tiny keyboard, searching for Victoria's name. And there it was, an email chain from last week forwarded to her from her maid of honor, with the subject line, "Pre-wedding pampering." In it, her friend had asked if they could really afford the big spa package, expressing concern over the cost. Victoria's reply, sent from her phone, was a single, cheerful, damning line. "Don't worry about it. Richard's mom is covering everything. Might as well go big, Luelle." Richard's mom. She didn't even have the decency, the basic respect to use my name. I was just a source of funds, an anonymous, faceless entity designated as Richard's mom to be exploited for her and her friend's pleasure. The casual cruelty of it, the gleeful, premeditated dishonesty, the flippant LOL at the end, it was like a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was theft, plain and simple, dressed up in the flimsy costume of familial privilege. This was the final, incontrovertible proof that I was nothing more to them than a bank account to be drained, a resource to be plundered before being put away. The woman in the mirror changed before my very eyes. The hurt in her eyes was still there, a deep, burning ember, but it was now surrounded by a cold blue flame of pure rage. The victim was gone. The nurse, the methodical, calm under pressure professional I had been for 30 years, the woman who knew how to triage a crisis and act decisively, took her place. I walked out of the restroom and back into the main kitchen area, my steps firm and purposeful. I found a quiet corner, away from the main hustle and bustle, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to my contacts. I didn't hesitate. I pressed Sarah's name. She answered on the first ring, her voice a worried hiss. "Eleanor, are you okay? I swear I'm about to come in there and drag you out myself. I don't care what anyone thinks." "I'm okay, Sarah," I said, my own voice startlingly calm, devoid of any emotion. "Actually, I'm better than okay. I'm clear." "Clear? What do you mean, clear?" "They've been stealing from me," I said, the words flat and factual, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. I quickly explained about the credit card charges and the email I had found. There was a moment of stunned silence on her end, followed by a sharp, furious intake of breath. "That little... Eleanor, that's fraud. That's a crime." "I know," I said, "and that's why I need to ask you a question. Your son, Mark, he's a lawyer, isn't he?" "Yes, a damn good one. Specializes in financial litigation." "Why?" "Because I'm going to need him," I said. A plan was forming, crystallizing out of the fog of my pain and humiliation. A plan that was smarter than screaming and more permanent than tears. But first, I'm going to make 2 quick calls. Don't go anywhere. The show's about to start. I hung up before she could reply. My fingers flew across the screen. First, I called the cell number for the band leader, a friendly man named John whom I had a pleasant conversation with just a week ago. Hello. Hi, John. This is Eleanor Vance. We have a contract for your band to play until midnight. That's right, Mrs. Vance. It's a great party. Hope you're enjoying it. The terms of our agreement included payment for the first half of the evening, which has now been completed. The second half of the performance is optional, at my discretion. I am choosing not to exercise that option. Your services are no longer required for the remainder of the evening. There was a sputtering on the other end. But we're on our break. We're scheduled to go back on in 15 minutes. All our equipment is set up. I suggest you begin packing up your equipment now then, I said coolly, and hung up. 1 down. Next, I dialed the venue manager, Mr. Henderson, whose personal number was on the master contract I had saved as a PDF in my phone. Henderson, his voice was curt. Mr. Henderson, this is Eleanor Vance, the signatory and sole payer for the Victoria and Richard wedding currently taking place in the Grand Ballroom. Mrs. Vance, is everything to your satisfaction this evening? Not entirely, I said, my voice like ice. As per our contract, the open bar service is scheduled until midnight, at my expense. I am officially terminating that service, effective immediately. Please instruct your staff to convert to a cash bar for all guests. A cash bar? Ma'am, the guests will be quite surprised. The guests can pay for their own drinks, I stated, leaving absolutely no room for argument. My financial obligations for the open bar are concluded as of this moment. There was a pregnant pause. I could hear him shuffling papers on his desk. I see your signature here. You are indeed the sole payer. Very well, ma'am. As you wish. We will inform the staff. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. And I ended the call. 2 down. I slipped the phone back into my small clutch purse. I took a deep, steadying breath. It wasn't over. It wasn't even close. This was just the opening salvo. I hadn't just been dismissed. I had been plundered. And the bill, for everyone involved, was coming due. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The temptation was there to do something dramatic, to post a picture of the $65,000 check on social media and let the court of public opinion eviscerate them. But that felt like something Victoria would do, a dramatic, petty gesture designed for maximum public consumption. My plan required precision, not pettiness. It required the skilled hand of a surgeon with a scalpel, not the blunt force of a sledgehammer. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since midnight, a relentless assault of notifications. I sat up in my quiet hotel room, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand, and began to read the texts from Victoria. I read them all, not as a mother, but as a detached observer, cataloging evidence for a case. 11:45 p.m. Mom, what happened to the band? People are confused. 11:55 p.m. Why is the bar charging people for drinks? This is so embarrassing. People are leaving. Call me right now. 12:30 a.m. Richard said he saw you on the phone near the gardens. Did you do this? This is our wedding. How could you? 2:15 a.m. I can't believe you would be so selfish and vindictive to try and ruin my one perfect day all because you were upset about the seating. It's pathetic. Pathetic. The word stung, but it also clarified everything. In her mind, my lifetime of sacrifice, my unwavering support, my very motherhood was worth less than her seating arrangement. My contribution of my entire life savings was an entitlement, and my reaction to being publicly humiliated, systematically erased, and financially exploited was pathetic. I didn't reply. Instead, at 9 a.m. sharp, I was sitting in a plush leather armchair in the polished downtown office of Henderson Black & Associates. Mark, Sarah's son, was the Associates. He was a handsome young man in his early 30s with his mother's kind, empathetic eyes, but a lawyer's sharp, analytical mind. He listened patiently, his expression growing grimmer by the second as I laid out the whole sordid story, from being led to the kitchen to the credit card statement, which I had printed out from the hotel business center with the fraudulent charges highlighted in bright yellow. He leaned back in his chair when I was finished, tapping a pen on a yellow legal pad. "First of all, Aunt Eleanor," he said, using the affectionate term he'd called me since he was a little boy playing in my backyard, "I am so sorry this happened to you. This is monstrous. It's beyond belief." "Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. But I'm not here for sympathy," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "I'm here for a strategy." "Okay," he said, leaning forward, his entire demeanor shifting from concerned nephew to sharp-witted professional. "From a legal standpoint, what you have here is clear credit card fraud. The email from Victoria is what we call a smoking gun. It proves intent. We can absolutely file a civil suit to recover the funds, and honestly, we could even bring this to the district attorney and press for criminal charges. Though that's a much more complicated and emotionally draining path, especially with family." I thought about it for a long moment. Dragging my own daughter through a criminal court? As much as she had hurt me, the thought of her facing jail time, of that being her future, turned my stomach. "I don't want to send her to jail," I said finally, "but I want my money back. All of it. The $65,000 for the wedding and the fraudulent charges on my card." "A lawsuit is the most direct path for that," Mark confirmed. "We would file a complaint and they would be served. It would get very ugly very quickly." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. "But you said something on the phone last night that stuck with me. You said you wanted to know why." "Yes," I said, my voice softening slightly. "That's the part I can't get past. This level of cruelty, this calculated deception, it doesn't just come from being spoiled. I raised her. I know I didn't raise a monster. Something else is going on here. And Richard, he seems to be at the very center of it." Mark nodded slowly. "And my line of work, when a situation doesn't make logical or emotional sense, you follow the money. You mentioned Richard's family seemed well off." "They certainly act the part," I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. "They live in a big house in a gated community, drive new cars. Victoria was very impressed by their status." "Sometimes that's all it is, an act," Mark said, his voice grim. "I have a man I use for sensitive cases like this, a private investigator. His name is Frank. He's ex-police, discreet, professional, and very, very good at digging up things people want to keep buried. He could look into Richard's financial situation, his business dealings, his family's assets. It might give us leverage in a settlement. More importantly, it might give you answers." A private investigator. The idea seemed so dramatic, like something out of a movie. But my life had already become a strange, painful drama. Why not embrace the role I had been given? The role of the investigator, the one seeking the unvarnished truth. "How much would that cost?" I asked. The practical nurse in me, the woman who had budgeted every penny for 30 years, taking over. "A few thousand for a comprehensive background and financial check," Mark said. "It's not cheap, but it could save you tens of thousands in the long run if we find what I suspect we might find. Think of it as an investment in your case." I thought of my savings account, the significant dent the wedding had already made. This would be another withdrawal, but it felt entirely different. The wedding money was an investment in a lie, a fantasy. This felt like an investment in the truth. "Do it," I said, a wave of pure, cold resolve washing over me. "I want to know everything. I want to know who my daughter married. I want to know who I gave my life's savings to." Mark smiled, a real, genuine smile, not the plastic, predatory version Richard wore. He said, "I was hoping you'd say that. You're a fighter, Eleanor. You always have been. They just forgot." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. The path ahead was uncertain and likely to be painful, but for the first time since I walked into that wedding venue, It was a path of my own making. I was no longer a victim reacting to their cruelty. I was the architect of my own justice. I had spent a lifetime providing for my daughter's future. Now I was finally investing in my own. The quiet campaign had officially begun. The wait for the investigators' report was a strange kind of purgatory. For 3 long days, I lived in a state of suspended animation, a holding pattern of anxiety and anticipation. I went through the motions of my quiet, retired life. I tended to my small garden. I read 3 novels back to back without retaining a single word. I took my small terrier mix Buster on long, aimless walks through the neighborhood. But my mind was elsewhere, constantly turning over the possibilities, imagining what secrets Frank, the investigator, might unearth. Each buzz of my phone made my heart leap into my throat, a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Victoria had tried calling a few more times, her attempts growing more sporadic. She left angry, tearful voicemails that I dutifully saved as evidence, but did not listen to. The sound of her voice was something I wasn't ready to face. Richard sent one final curt text message that read, "Your behavior was unacceptable. You owe Victoria and me a sincere apology." I actually laughed out loud when I read that one, a short, sharp, humorless sound. The sheer unmitigated audacity of the man was almost impressive in its own way. On the 4th day, a Thursday afternoon, Mark called. His voice was grim. "Eleanor, can you come to my office? The preliminary report from Frank is in." An hour later, I was back in the same plush leather chair, a plain manila folder sitting on the polished table in front of me. It looked thin, innocuous, but I knew it contained a story. Mark had a somber expression on his face. "It's pretty much what we suspected," he said, his voice low. "Only worse."
He opened the folder and slid the first page across the table to me. It was a summary of Richard's personal finances. It was a complete and utter disaster. The much-touted tech startup he was so proud of, the one he claimed was on the verge of a major promotion in its industry, was little more than a slick website, a rented mailbox, and a mountain of crippling debt. The report detailed how he had defaulted on 2 separate small business loans. He had maxed out 6 different credit cards. He was, in no uncertain terms, paying for his flashy lifestyle of expensive dinners and designer clothes with smoke, mirrors, and other people's money. "He's broke," I breathed, staring at the damning columns of red ink. "Worse than broke," Mark corrected gently. "He's drowning. Frank's analysis indicates he was likely weeks, if not days, away from having to declare bankruptcy. That $65,000 you gave them wasn't just for a wedding, Eleanor. It was a lifeline. It was a desperate, last-minute cash infusion to keep his whole charade going a little longer." The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The urgency to get the money from me, the way they had brushed aside my involvement in the wedding planning once the check had cleared. Richard's insufferable smugness. He wasn't just marrying my daughter, he was executing a financial rescue mission, with me as the unwitting and unwilling financier. But it was the next page of the report that made my blood run cold. It was a profile of his family. The big, impressive house in the gated community, it was mortgaged to the hilt, with a second mortgage, a high-interest, risky loan, taken out just 6 months ago. Their new luxury cars they drove? Leased. Their supposed wealth, the status that had so dazzled my daughter, was a house of cards, and a strong wind was blowing. "So they're all in on it," I said, my voice flat, devoid of surprise. "His parents, too?" The memory of Richard's mother, Mrs. Davis, giving that subtle, approving nod as I was led to the kitchen like a servant, took on a new, sinister meaning. They weren't just snobs who looked down on my simple middle-class life. They were co-conspirators in a long con. "It certainly appears so," Mark said, his voice grim. "They needed this wedding. They needed your money. And they needed you out of the way so no one, especially your friends who know your financial situation, would ask any awkward questions about who was really funding this lavish affair." I felt a wave of pure physical nausea. I had been played, not just by my daughter and her new husband, but by his entire family. I thought back to the dinners we'd had, the polite, stilted conversations, the way they had praised Victoria and welcomed her into their fold. All of it had been an act, a carefully rehearsed performance for an audience of one, the woman with the checkbook. I flipped to the next page, my hands feeling strangely disconnected from my body. It was a public record search on Victoria. My heart hammered against my ribs. What could be there? Then I saw it. It wasn't a secret. Not really, but it was a detail I hadn't allowed myself to think about in years. It was a record of a legal name change filed when Victoria had turned 18. She had legally changed her last name from Vance, my name, the name of the woman who raised her, to Sterling, Michael's last name, the name of the father who had abandoned her and never paid a cent in support. She had told me at the time it was just to feel more connected to her father's side of the family, that it didn't mean anything. I had been deeply hurt, feeling it as a profound rejection, but I'd accepted it, chalking it up to the often inscrutable whims of a teenager trying to find her own identity after the divorce. Now, seeing it in the cold black and white print of an investigator's report, it felt like what it truly was, the first real act of erasure. The first time she had consciously chosen his narrative of abandonment over my reality of sacrifice. She hadn't just started rejecting me at her wedding, she had started cutting me out of her life, piece by piece, a long, long time ago. I closed the folder, my hands feeling strangely disconnected from my body. The shock was gone, replaced by a steely, chilling clarity. "This changes things, Mark," I said, my voice low and determined. "How so?" "My goal is no longer just getting the money back," I said, looking him straight in the eye, my gaze unwavering. "My goal is the truth, all of it. I need to understand the why behind all this. And I think there's only one person left who can tell me." "Victoria?" Mark asked. "No," I said, a deep, profound sadness settling over me like a shroud. "Michael. It's time I had a talk with the man who started all of this." Making the decision to call Michael was one thing. Actually picking up the phone and dialing the number of the man who had been a ghost in my life for 15 years was another thing entirely. He was a chapter I had forced myself to close, a wound I thought had scarred over. Our last real conversation had been a stilted, infuriating exchange over the phone about his consistent failure to contribute to Victoria's college fund. I remembered the litany of excuses, the empty promises, the same fundamental weakness that had defined him during our divorce. After that call, I had finally completely given up. I accepted that I was on my own, that he was a phantom in our lives, a phantom with a last name Victoria now carried as her own. A quick, unsettlingly easy internet search provided his current phone number. He was a regional sales manager for a large paper company in Pennsylvania, living a whole other life I knew nothing about. I stared at the 10 digits on my phone screen for a full 10 minutes, my thumb hovering over the green call button. My little terrier mix Buster, sensing my turmoil, came and rested his furry head on my knee, letting out a soft whine. I took a deep breath, patted his head, and pressed the button before I could lose my nerve. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up, my resolution faltering, when he answered. "Hello? Michael Sterling speaking?" His voice was the same, that slightly reedy, perpetually hesitant tone I remembered with a startling, unwelcome clarity. "Michael, it's Eleanor." The silence on the other end of the line was profound, a vacuum of shock and disbelief. I could hear his faint, surprised intake of breath, a small, sharp sound across the miles. "Eleanor? My God, is everything okay? Is it Victoria?" The immediate jump to a catastrophe was so typical of him. "Victoria is fine," I said, my voice carefully modulated, even in calm. "She just got married." "Married?" He echoed, his voice laced with surprise and an unmistakable note of guilt. That's wonderful. That's great. I'm glad she's happy." He stammered, clearly flustered and unsure of where this conversation was going. This was my moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of his past failings. I just stated a simple, devastating fact. They sat me in the kitchen, Michael. Another silence, longer and heavier this time. I could almost picture him on the other end, running a hand through his thinning hair. What? What do you mean they sat you in the kitchen? I said, my voice flat. Exactly what it sounds like. Behind the swinging metal doors, on a folding chair, next to a broken catering cart. They said I would ruin the aesthetic of the photographs. I heard him let out a long, heavy sigh, a weary sound that seemed to travel across the phone lines and settle in my own chest. Oh, Eleanor, God, I'm so sorry.
I'm not calling you for an apology, Michael, I said, cutting him off before he could launch into a litany of useless platitudes. I'm calling for an explanation, not about Richard, but about Victoria. This isn't just about a wedding. This is about years of something I can't understand. She changed her name to yours. She has spent her whole adult life pulling away from me while taking everything I could possibly give her. You're her father. I thought maybe you could help me understand why she would be capable of such deliberate cruelty. He didn't answer right away. I could hear the faint, static-filled sound of his breathing, the unspoken weight of years of secrets. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, laced with a shame that was decades old. Eleanor, there's something you don't know. Something I should have told you years ago, after the divorce, during the custody hearing, but I was a coward. I've always been a coward. The word custody hung in the air between us. There was never a real custody battle. He had just left. He'd signed the papers giving me full custody without a single fight. At the time, I thought it was because he didn't care enough to fight. Now, I wondered if there was another reason. What is it, Michael? I pressed, my patience wearing thin. It's about Victoria, he said, his voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't quite place. After the wedding, she called me, crying, ranting. She told me what she'd done. She wasn't proud of it, Eleanor. She was cornered. Cornered by what? A seating chart? I asked, my voice sharp with sarcasm. No, he said softly. Cornered by the truth. Eleanor, Victoria knows she's adopted. The world tilted on its axis and spun into a silent, colorless void. My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles turned white, the plastic digging into my skin. What are you talking about? Adopted? I gave birth to her at St. Mary's Hospital on May 3rd, 1993. I remember the pain. I remember holding her. I heard him take a shaky, ragged breath. No, Eleanor, you didn't. The story tumbled out of him then, a torrent of confession that had been dammed up for 32 years. The real story, the one that began before I was ever in the picture. He had a brief, frantic affair with another woman a year before we were married, a young, terrified girl from a strict family who got pregnant. She had the baby, a little girl, in secret. 6 weeks later, she showed up at his apartment, dropped the child in his arms with a note saying she couldn't do it, and disappeared from his life forever. Panicked, ashamed, and terrified of the consequences, he hid the baby from his family. And when he married me, a woman he knew desperately wanted a family, he presented this child, Victoria, as his own. And I, young and in love and so trusting, had never questioned it. The dates lined up. Close enough. The lie was born. Victoria was never my biological daughter. She was never my flesh and blood. I sank into a nearby armchair, the phone pressed hard against my ear, my mind reeling. My entire life, my entire identity as a mother was a fabrication. Every sacrifice, every double shift, every pen spent on her inheritance that I was building, every moment of pride at her promotion in school, was all for a child who wasn't mine. A stranger's child. She knows? I whispered, my throat tight, the words feeling like sandpaper. He found some papers in my old desk when she was visiting me in college, Michael admitted, his voice thick with shame. A birth certificate with another woman's name on it. She confronted me. I told her everything. The whole sordid story. She made me swear not to tell you. She was afraid. She was terrified you'd stop loving her if you knew you weren't her real mother. So instead, I finished for him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying, devastating clarity. She chose to resent me. Her pulling away, her obsession with his family name, her desperate need for the legitimacy of Richard's good family. She had been living with this secret, this feeling of being an imposter in her own life. She wasn't rejecting me because she was spoiled or cruel. She was rejecting me out of a deep-seated fear and a twisted, misplaced resentment that the very foundation of her entire life, her relationship with me, was a lie. Eleanor, I am so sorry, Michael whispered, his voice breaking. I ruined everything. I was a coward. I'm sorry. Yes, you were, I said, the words hollow, devoid of anger. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt nothing but a vast, empty, silent expanse where my life used to be. I had been mourning the loss of a daughter. Now I was mourning the loss of a life I never truly had. I ended the call without saying goodbye. The truth wasn't a key that unlocked understanding and healing. It was a bomb that had detonated in the very center of my past, obliterating everything I thought I knew to be true. For 2 full days, I existed in a thick, disorienting fog. The revelation about Victoria's birth didn't just change the past, it poisoned it. Every memory I held dear was now suspect, tainted by a lie I didn't even know existed. Every, "I love you, Mommy," I remembered now seemed like a line in a play I didn't know I was acting in. Her childhood, my motherhood, our entire shared history felt like a phantom limb. I could feel it, but it wasn't real. The grief was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. But underneath that crushing weight of grief, something else was slowly, quietly taking root. Not anger. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard ash. This new feeling was a strange, liberating detachment. The invisible chains of obligation, of unconditional maternal love that had bound me for 32 years had been shattered. I was no longer Eleanor, the wronged mother. I was simply Eleanor, a woman who had been deceived by 2 people and systematically used by a third. On the 3rd day, the fog began to lift, replaced by a chilling, crystalline clarity. I picked up the phone and called Mark. I have the why, I told him, my voice devoid of any emotion. It was flat, clinical. I relayed the entire story Michael had told me, from the affair to the secret adoption to Victoria's discovery. He was silent for a long time on the other end of the line, the only sound the faint hum of his office. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, laced with a shame that was decades old. Eleanor, I have no words, he said finally, his voice a mixture of shock and compassion. This is beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. This isn't just a financial case anymore. There is no need for words, Mark, I replied, my voice still unnervingly calm. There's a need for action. I want you to arrange a meeting. A meeting? He asked, a note of caution in his voice. Are you sure you're ready for that? I am more than ready, I said. I want it at your office. Invite Victoria and Richard. Tell them it's to discuss a potential financial settlement to avoid further legal action. Frame it as their chance to get out of this quietly. They're greedy, and as we know, they're desperate. They'll come. They'll walk in thinking they can manipulate me one last time, maybe bully me into giving them more money to make this all go away. And what's the real purpose of the meeting, Eleanor? Mark asked, and I could hear a hint of admiration creeping into his professional tone. The truth, I said simply. Not a shouting match, not a tearful confrontation, a presentation. A calm, orderly, and brutal presentation of the facts. I want them to sit there and see their entire sordid little enterprise laid bare on your conference table. I want them to see the full picture of their own ugliness. And then, I want to be free. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. The day arrived gray and overcast, the sky a blanket of bruised purple, a perfect reflection of my mood. I chose my outfit with the care of a general preparing for a final, decisive battle. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored pair of black trousers and a crisp, white silk blouse. It was the armor of a professional, not the finery of a victim. I wasn't the mother of the bride anymore. I was the plaintiff.
Sarah insisted on coming with me. "I'm not letting you face those vipers alone," she had said, her voice fierce. "I've been with you through the divorce, the funeral of your mother, and every crisis in between. I'm not missing this." I was grateful for her solid, unwavering presence beside me as we rode the silent elevator up to Mark's office. We were shown to a large conference room on the top floor. It was a cold, impersonal space, designed for conflict and resolution. A long, polished mahogany cable reflected the gloomy sky outside the wall of windows that overlooked the city. It was neutral ground. It was my ground. I chose a seat at one side of the table, with Mark at the head and Sarah beside me. We sat in a comfortable silence, a silent council of three, waiting. At 2 o'clock on the dot, the heavy oak door opened, and they walked in. Victoria and Richard. They were a perfect picture of aggrieved entitlement, radiating an aura of indignation. Richard wore an expensive suit, his face set in a mask of stern, paternal disapproval, as if he were the one who had been wronged. Victoria looked pale and drawn, but her eyes were defiant, a cornered animal ready to lash out. They clearly saw themselves as the injured party, forced to take time out of their important lives to deal with a hysterical, vengeful old woman. "Eleanor," Richard began, his tone dripping with condescension before he had even sat down, "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. This whole situation has been deeply, deeply upsetting for Victoria." Mark cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that cut Richard off mid-sentence. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice cool and formal, using Richard's last name with a pointed emphasis. "Please, have a seat. This is a formal meeting. My client, Miss Vance, will not be speaking directly with you at this time. All communication will be through me." The use of Miss Vance and client visibly threw them. They had come expecting a messy, emotional family drama, not a corporate-style deposition. They exchanged a quick, uncertain look and sat down opposite us, their carefully constructed confidence wavering for the very first time. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The stage was set. I looked at the thick file folder in front of Mark, the one containing all their lies, all their secrets. The luncheon of truth was about to be served, and I knew they would find it very hard to swallow. Mark began without preamble, his voice calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion, filling the sterile conference room with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "Thank you for coming. We've called this meeting today to review certain financial discrepancies surrounding your recent wedding, with the goal of reaching a swift and final resolution." With a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he slid two thick, neatly bound folders across the polished mahogany table, one stopping perfectly in front of Richard, the other in front of Victoria. "If you'd please open the folders to the first tab." Richard, ever the alpha male, opened his with a dismissive flick of his wrist, a look of bored arrogance still plastered on his face.
Victoria's movements were more hesitant, her hands trembling slightly as she untied the ribbon holding the folder closed. I watched their eyes, and only their eyes, as they took in the first document. It was a pristine color copy of my credit card statement, the series of unauthorized charges highlighted in a fluorescent, almost accusatory yellow. "As you can see," Mark continued, his voice as smooth and cool as the table surface, "there are several charges totaling $2,147.58 for services and goods that my client did not purchase or authorize. We have reason to believe you, Mrs. Sterling, made these charges using my client's card without her explicit permission for these specific items." Victoria's head snapped up, her face a mask of indignation. "That's ridiculous. My mother gave me her card to use for wedding expenses." "Indeed she did," Mark said smoothly, without missing a beat. He didn't even glance at his notes. "Which brings us to Exhibit B, on the next page." He nodded at their folders. "If you'll please turn to the next document." It was the printout of the email. The words seemed to leap off the page in the silent room. "Richard's mom is covering everything. Might as well go big, LOL." Victoria's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red in a matter of seconds. She looked from the damning piece of paper to me, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. Richard shot her a furious sideways glance, a look of pure venom that told me this was a piece of evidence he was not prepared for. His composure was beginning to crack at the edges. "Moving on," Mark said, his voice relentlessly placid, ignoring Victoria's silent implosion. "Let's discuss the wedding itself. The total cost, paid in full by Miss Vance from her personal retirement savings, was $65,000. It was an extraordinarily generous gift made under the assumption of a celebration of love and family." He paused, letting the weight of the words, and the sum, hang in the air. "However, certain events that transpired at the wedding have brought the very nature of this gift into question." He gestured for them to turn the page again. Exhibit C. It was a sworn and notarized affidavit from the band leader, John, detailing the phone call he received from me terminating his contract due to a breach of goodwill. Exhibit D was a similar, equally formal statement from the venue manager, Mr. Henderson, regarding the abrupt cancellation of the open bar service. "My mother humiliated me," Victoria burst out, her voice rising in pitch, finally finding her words. "She acted like a child." "My client," Mark said, his voice hardening ever so slightly, the first crack in his professional veneer, "acted entirely within her rights as the sole financial sponsor of the event after being subjected to what any reasonable person, and certainly any court, would consider extreme emotional distress and public humiliation. Being sequestered in a kitchen next to a broken catering cart does not typically fall under the umbrella of mother of the bride duties." Richard leaned forward, his arrogance returning like a reflex. He was on more familiar ground now, trying to bully his way through. "This is a family matter, a simple misunderstanding that's been blown way out of proportion. It's absurd to involve lawyers. What is it you really want, Eleanor? Is this about attention? Do you want more money? Is that it?" I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him, my expression as unreadable as a blank stone, and let his pathetic accusations hang in the air and die. Mark answered for me, his voice dripping with ice. "What my client wants is restitution and clarity." Which brings us to our final exhibit for this portion of the meeting. "This one is for you, Mr. Sterling." He slid a third, even thicker folder across the table, this one for Richard alone. Richard opened it, and I watched with a kind of detached fascination as every last vestige of color drained from his face. He looked as if he'd been physically punched in the gut. His confident posture collapsed, and he seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. "This," he explained calmly, "is a preliminary financial profile compiled by a licensed private investigator.
It details your outstanding personal and business debts of over $150,000, the precarious, over-leveraged financial state of your family's assets, the impending and frankly inevitable bankruptcy of your so-called business. It paints a very clear picture, Mr. Sterling, the picture of a man who desperately needed a cash infusion, a man for whom a $65,000 wedding, paid for by his new, trusting mother-in-law, was not a celebration of love, but a fraudulent financial bailout. Richard stared at the papers, his hands trembling so violently he had to place them flat on the table. The mask was gone, the bully was gone. All that was left was a desperate, frightened, and thoroughly exposed man. Victoria looked from Richard's horrified face to the folder, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, sickening horror. "Richard, what is he talking about? Bankruptcy? You told me your business was about to get a huge promotion, a government contract."
Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. He was trapped in a cage built of his own lies. Victoria turned her panicked, tear-filled gaze to me. The anger was completely gone now, replaced by a desperate, childlike pleading. "Mom, what is all this? You hired a private investigator? Why would you do this to us? Why?" The room was silent. Mark had laid the foundation, brick by meticulous brick. He had presented the evidence of their greed and their deception. The logical case was closed. Now, it was my turn. The final blow wasn't in the folders, it was in my heart, and it was ready to be spoken. I took a slow, deep, cleansing breath and prepared to speak for the very first time. I met Victoria's desperate, pleading gaze across the vast, polished expanse of the mahogany table. For the first time since the meeting began, I spoke, and the sound of my own voice, quiet but clear, seemed to absorb all the tension in the room. "I did it, Victoria," I began, my voice steady and even, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos swirling around her. "Because for the first time in my life, I decided to invest in myself instead of you. I invested in the truth. It was the best money I've ever spent." My eyes drifted from her tear-streaked face to Richard, who was still staring at the financial report as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. "You, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "this was never about love for you, was it? It was a business transaction, a hostile takeover. You didn't marry a woman, you acquired an asset. My daughter was the bait. And my life savings, my inheritance from my own parents, my retirement, were the prize. You needed my money to prop up your pathetic, failing house of cards, and you were more than willing to humiliate and discard the source of that money as soon as the check cleared. The only thing I still don't understand is whether you are more of a fool for thinking you could get away with it, or more of a coward for using a woman to solve your financial problems." His head jerked up, a flash of impotent anger in his eyes, but he said nothing. He had nothing to say. The numbers in the folder spoke for him, a chorus of failure and deceit. Then I turned my full, undivided attention back to Victoria. The anger in her face had completely crumbled, replaced by the raw, bewildered pain of a lost child. "Mom, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this to me?" "I'm not doing this to you, Victoria," I said, and the distinction was crucial, for her and for me. "I am doing this for me. For weeks, since that horrible day, I've been asking myself one single question over and over again. Why? Why would the daughter I raised, the little girl I gave everything to, treat me with such profound, calculated cruelty? At first I thought it was because you were spoiled. Then I thought it was Richard's toxic influence. But it's much deeper, much older than that, isn't it?" I paused, holding her gaze, not letting her look away.
I called your father, Victoria. I called Michael. The name father hung in the air between us like a ghost. I saw a flicker of sheer, unadulterated panic in her eyes. She knew what was coming. The final, hidden pillar of her life was about to be pulled away. I told him everything, I said softly, my voice gentle now, not with pity, but with the simple finality of a diagnosis. I told you you found the papers when you were visiting him in college. I told you you've known for over a decade that you were adopted. It was as if I sucked all the air out of the room. Sarah let out a small, sharp gasp beside me, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard looked from me to Victoria, his expression of utter, slack-jawed shock. This was a secret she had kept even from him, the man she had supposedly built a life with. So you see, I continued, my voice a calm, clinical dissection of her soul, your cruelty wasn't about a seating chart. It's never been about me. It's been about you. It's been about your secret, your own crippling fear of not belonging, of being an imposter. All these years you've been punishing me for a lie that Michael told, a lie I didn't even know existed. You resented me for a love you thought was conditional, because deep down, you didn't feel like you were my real daughter. Tears were streaming down Victoria's face now, silent, hot tears of shame and utter exposure. She wasn't just crying, she was grieving for the loss of her secrets. So, you latched on to Richard's family, I went on, my voice relentlessly logical, but not unkind. You craved their name, their supposed status, their history, because you felt you had no real roots of your own. You tried to erase me, the one constant, the one solid ground you've had your entire life, in order to build a new identity on a foundation of his family's lies and my money. I leaned forward slightly, my hands folded calmly on the table, a picture of serene control. Well, the foundation is rotten, Victoria, and the house you tried to build on it is collapsing around you. I finally looked away from her devastated face and addressed Mark, my voice crisp and businesslike once more. Mark, what are our terms? Mark, recovering from his own surprise at the final revelation, cleared his throat and instantly became the lawyer again. The terms are simple and non-negotiable, he said, his voice ringing with authority. You will repay Miss Vance in full, the $65,000 for the wedding, plus the $2,147.58 in fraudulent charges. You will both sign a legally binding repayment agreement today before you leave this room. If you default on a single payment, we will immediately file a civil suit for the full amount, plus punitive damages and all associated legal fees. All the evidence you see here, including the investigator's report and Mr. Sterling's confession regarding the adoption, will be submitted to the court. We will win. It's not a possibility, it's a certainty. He let that sink in, the threat of public ruin hanging heavy in the air. Furthermore, he added, his eyes like steel, any attempt to contact, harass, or malign Miss Vance in any way, publicly or privately, will be met with an immediate filing for a restraining order and further legal action. Is that understood? Richard, utterly defeated, just nodded numbly. Victoria was sobbing quietly now, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. My work was done. I had laid the truth bare. I had reclaimed my power not through shouting or tears or vengeance, but through quiet, methodical action and unvarnished truth. I looked at the crying woman across the table. I didn't feel hatred. I didn't even feel pity. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the little girl she used to be, the one who was so afraid of being unloved, and a quiet, liberating peace for the woman I was about to become. I stood up. Sarah stood with me, a silent, supportive shadow. Mark, we're finished here. Please handle the paperwork. Without another glance at the wreckage of the two lives sitting across from me, I turned and walked out of the conference room, my head held high. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the sound of a final, clean, and long overdue break. The 3 months that followed the meeting were like the slow, deep, cleansing breath you take after a violent storm has finally passed. The air was clean, the world was quiet, and the landscape of my life, while irrevocably changed, felt full of new, sunlit possibility. Mark, true to his word, handled everything with quiet efficiency. Victoria and Richard, faced with irrefutable evidence and the terrifying threat of public legal action that would expose their entire fraudulent charade, signed the repayment agreement without protest. The first payment arrived in my bank account a month later, a small, almost pitiful sum, but it was a start. It was never really about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was the legal and financial acknowledgement of the debt, a tangible symbol of their accountability.
The first thing I did to truly begin my new life was to reclaim my home. For years, every surface, every corner had held a memory of Victoria. Her framed graduation photos on the mantelpiece, her childhood drawings held by magnets on the refrigerator, a shelf of her favorite books in the living room. One Saturday, Sarah came over with 2 large, empty boxes and a bottle of good Chardonnay. We spent the entire day carefully packing it all away. It wasn't an act of anger or vengeance, but of cleansing, of purification. I wasn't trying to erase her from my life. I was simply, finally, making space for my own. I replaced her photos with pictures that made me smile. A photo of Sarah and me on a trip to the coast years ago, laughing so hard we were crying. A picture of Buster chasing a bright red ball in the park, his ears flying back in pure joy. A beautiful framed print of the irises from my garden, the ones I was so proud of. Slowly, lovingly, my house started to feel like my house again. Not just the carefully preserved museum of someone else's childhood. Life settled into a new, peaceful, and profoundly welcome rhythm. I started a weekly lunch date with a group of retired nurses from the hospital, women I had worked alongside for decades but had been too busy being a mother to truly befriend. We talked and laughed for hours, sharing stories of our lives, our joys, our sorrows. I joined a book club, something I'd always wanted to do, and discovered a love for historical fiction. I even started taking a pottery class at the local community center on Tuesday nights. My first creations were lopsided, clumsy things, but the feeling of the cool, wet clay spinning beneath my hands was grounding, a reminder that it was possible to take something formless and chaotic and shape it into something new, something of my own making. I found a deep, quiet joy in the simple, unassuming texture of my own days, a joy that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or happiness. Today is a perfect Saturday in late September. The air is crisp with the first delicious hint of autumn, and the maple tree in my backyard is just beginning to blush with color. I'm in my garden, hosting a small party. It's not a lavish, expensive affair. There are no caterers or string quartets, just a simple wooden table laden with food I cooked myself. A big salad from my garden, a homemade lasagna, and the apple pie Sarah brought. The guests are the people who form the true foundation of my life. Sarah is here, of course, her warm laughter echoing through the garden. Mark is here with his lovely wife, teasing me about my collection of lopsided pottery mugs. My neighbors of 20 years, David and Susan, are here, sharing a funny story that makes everyone roar with laughter. As I look at their faces, these dear, familiar faces, bathed in the warm afternoon sun, I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. For so long, I thought my sole purpose in life was to be a mother. I thought my inheritance to the world, my legacy, was my daughter. I was wrong. My purpose is simply to be Eleanor, My inheritance is the hard-won peace I have fought for, the quiet dignity I have reclaimed, and the genuine, unconditional love I now share with people who see me, all of me, for who I am. The journey to get here was agonizing. Discovering that the life you dedicated yourself to is built on a foundation of lies is a pain I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But that pain was a crucible, and it forged something new in me. It taught me lessons that I now carry with me every single day. It taught me that love should not be a blank check, and sacrifice is only noble when it is honored and reciprocated. It taught me that sometimes the most powerful act of love is to love yourself enough to build a boundary, to say with a clear voice, "No more," and to have the strength to walk away from those who would diminish you. True forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about forgetting what they did. It's about remembering every single day that you deserved better. I'm not a victim, I'm not a hero. I'm just a woman who was pushed too far and discovered to her own surprise that she was strong enough to push back. I found out that my value isn't determined by how others treat me, but how I choose to treat and stand up for myself. So, thank you, all of you, for listening to my story. It means more than you know to be heard, to be seen. My question for you as I sit here in my peaceful garden is this: what has been your journey to reclaiming your own value? What was the moment you knew you had to stand up for yourself and draw your own line in the sand? I truly look forward to reading your stories in the comments. We are all so much stronger and so much less alone when we share our truths.